record button and welcome everyone to the Thursday, November 19th, bi-monthly IWWG Open Mic Reading Series. We're so glad that you are here. And I'm Kelly Dumar, and I am a longtime board member of the Guild, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this open mic. Now, if you would mute yourselves, if you are not already muted, that would be wonderful. So, I was thinking a little bit about how important this community is, how important it is, as the CDC is telling us, don't travel, keep your Thanksgiving to your own household, stay home, be safe. How important it is that we do have opportunities like this through the generosity of our readers and you, that we all come together and have a chance to speak and listen to each other. And a big part of what our open mic really aims to do is to have this exchange of listening. And I have to say that I do think of the Guild and the audiences that we draw and the experiences we create really do honor listening to all voices. And that's really what we try to do here. Well, Amy Lowell, well-known poet who lived 1874 to 1925, has a poem about listening, and I wanted to share that with you today. It's in the public domain. I'm going to read to you, and because there's a few things in here that I think are just so wonderfully attuned to this season and the importance of listening and being connected to each other right now. Listening, 'tis you that are the music, not your song. The song is but a door which, opening wide, lets forth the pent-up melody inside. Your spirit's harmony, which clear and strong sing but of you. Throughout your whole life long, your songs, your thoughts, your doings, each divide this perfect beauty, waves within a tide, or single notes amid a glorious throng. The song of earth has many different chords. Ocean has many moods and many tones, yet always ocean. In the damp spring woods, the painted trillium smiles, while crisp pine cones, autumn alone can ripen. So is this one music with 1,000 cadences.
Lovely.
Well, we are here also to hear one of the songs of Jennifer Smith Turner, who's going to read today for us from her beautiful novel, Child Bride, which is an award-winning novel. She was awarded the national recognition through the New York City Big Book Award for Child Bride, historical fiction. She was the winner. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Jennifer Smith Turner. I happen to know that she lives on the island of Martha's Vineyard, which is off the coast of Massachusetts and is a part of Massachusetts. That's where I live. And she's the author of 2 poetry books as well, Lost and Found and Rhyming Verse Honoring African-American Heroes, and Perennial Secrets, Poetry and Prose. She has some interesting background that I thought you would want to know. She has served as interim president and CEO of Newman's Own Foundation, where she's a board member. And she's the retired CEO of Girl Scouts of Connecticut. During her professional career, she served as an appointed government official with the state of Connecticut and the city of Hartford, as a corporate and nonprofit executive, and as a member of many academic and nonprofit boards of directors. She received a BA from Union College and her master's from Fairfield University. She's a recipient of an honorary doctorate of humane letters from the University of Hartford, and she's a native of Boston. And she spent most of her professional career in Connecticut, but as I said, she now lives on the vineyard with her husband, Eric Turner. One other thing I wanted to read in there. Just wanted to read the Kirkus review for her book, Child Bride. Turner's warm and personal narrative brings to life the vigor and interdependence of Black communities in both the South and the North of the mid-20th century. uplifting and dynamic, a captivating story of a strong African-American woman who pursues her dreams. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today to read Jennifer Smith Turner.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and for all of you for signing in. This is so lovely to have you participate. I'm going to show you a cover of the book. There you can see Child Bride. And the story I'll tell you about the cover is that is actually a photograph of my mother holding my oldest brother, circa about 1947, when she was 18 years old. And she was my biggest supporter and about encouraging me to write. And it wasn't sadly until she passed away that I actually heard what she was saying to me and started to move away from my what was the business professional career and focus on writing. So what I'd like to do is to read a little bit of the first chapter and then talk a little about the book and the process and how I got here. So Child Bride is the story of a protagonist. Her name is Nell, and she's born in the segregated South. She's married off when she's very young, and she migrates and is part of the Great Migration into the North. And it follows all of her trials and tribulations that she encounters being married when she's 16 and a mother when she is very young. So this is the opening piece. It sort of gives you the setting of where her life is coming from as it starts out. So Child Bride, Chapter 1. My childhood farm in Louisiana wasn't much to look at. It stood on a long, dusty road, one of many small hog and pecan farms owned and worked by the descendants of sharecroppers and former slaves. Our house had been built by hand. The wood shingles were uneven, the doors never closed completely, and the window frames were crooked. 90-degree angles didn't find a home in this house. We had a few pictures hanging on the wall right by the front door near a window. One was of my grandparents, my daddy's parents. The image was murky, all dark and grainy, as if the camera needed a better focus on their faces. My grandparents stood shoulder to shoulder in the picture, their bodies framed in an oval cutout. Their eyes looked straight ahead, staring into the camera and at me whenever I was close to the picture. There were no smiles or grins on their faces. It was as though they were angry, unhappy, or tired, weary, like my daddy sometimes looked when he came in from the fields. Grandma's hair was pulled back in a tight bun with a straight part down the middle of her head. Grandpa had hair all over his face, a thick mustache and long beard that looked rugged and wiry, like the steel wool in the kitchen Mama used to clean pots and pans. My daddy looked a lot like his daddy. Every time Daddy walked past their picture, he'd give the frame a little nudge to straighten it, but it never seemed to work. If the frame was parallel to the door frame, it was crooked to the window casing. And when it lined up with the angle of the window, it was lopsided to the door frame. The few times the picture actually looked straight, with my grandparents' eyes level with my daddy's eyes, both the door and the window seemed to slope to one side. I took to just tilting my head left or right to look at the picture. Seemed to be easier. But Daddy always touched the frame. We didn't have a picture of my mama's parents on the wall. She kept their picture in the drawer of the nightstand by the bed. Sometimes I'd see her holding the picture, stroking the glass on the frame. I asked her once why her parents' picture wasn't on the wall. She looked sad and said, "I like to have them close to me at night." The sweeping front porch was the best part of the house. There we'd spend hot evenings waiting for the slightest breeze to move the heavy Louisiana air in hopes of a moment of coolness. We children would grab our pillows and sheets, lay our bodies on the porch for the night, giggle and tease one another. Stretched out on our backs, hands behind our heads, faces turned to the heavens, we'd count the stars and hope to see the tail of a shooting star make its way across the sky. One time, Robert, the oldest, stayed a while with us and explained the different star formations. "See that over there? That's the North Star. It's the brightest star in the sky." He pointed up, and our eyes followed the angle of his finger. "If you start at the North Star, you can outline the Little Dipper. The North Star is the tip of the handle. See there, the brightest star? and the ladle part is connected, like the ladle we use to scoop water at the well. Robert, I asked, how do you know what star is about in the sky? He lay still for a moment, his head tilted all the way back as if he were letting sunshine soak into his skin. Once I dreamed learning about the sky and stars, how it all came to be, what the proper names are for each star and planet. I wanted to be a learned man, no more than just farm and fields knowing. But schooling wasn't meant for me, or me for it. He fell silent again, rubbed his forehead, and went inside, leaving us, the little ones, to guess at the stars' names for ourselves. The crickets and cicadas provided background sounds to our astral explorations, and then the fireflies began their light dance, bringing the stars even closer to us. We reveled in our sanctuary until the mosquitoes and flies forced us back inside. The other family gathering place was the kitchen. Food was cleaned, prepared, eaten, and stored there. It was the largest room of the house, the place where my mama spent most of her time. Mama taught me how to measure seasonings at the kitchen counter that my daddy and brothers had built. Just a pinch of salt. Soon you know what a pinch feels like, she'd say. I watched her pinch seasonings from the palm of her hand, her fingertips becoming measuring tools. One day, Mama told me to make the breakfast biscuits by myself. I can help if you need me, she said. I got the ingredients from the food cabinet and icebox: flour, baking soda, yeast, sugar, salt, eggs, butter, and milk. I arranged everything on the counter, placed the mixing bowl in the center, and grabbed the tools I needed to make the biscuits. I looked at Mama. Do I have it right so far? She nodded her head and went about making the breakfast meat and eggs. I folded the dry stuff together just the way Mama had shown me. Then I added the eggs, butter, and liquids and stirred using a fork. Dough started to form. I thought the mixture was ready to be pressed into lumps and go onto the baking sheet. Is this ready, Mama? You the cook, you decide, she said as she turned the bacon over. But just as I was about to put the first mound of dough on the baking sheet, Mama coughed and said, best to grease the sheet. That way the biscuits won't stick to the pan. It's also good to put food in a hot oven. I took a stick of butter and ran it across the baking sheet, leaving thick clumps everywhere. The matches for the oven were sitting on the counter next to Mama. She stepped aside so I could get them and open the oven door. The only other time I'd lit the oven, Mama had let me strike the match, but she put it into the pilot light to start the flame while I worked the oven dial. I looked up at her now to see if she was going to help, but she didn't turn my way. I tried to strike the match, but nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. On my next try, the match lit and broke at the same time, causing a flame to fall to the floor. I jumped back and stomped my foot on the tiny fire. Mama, I need help, I cried out to her. A cook got to know how to strike a match and light an oven. Try again. This time, the match lit on the first strike. I placed it in the opening for the oven and turned the temperature dial as far as it would go to the right. To my young eyes, it seemed as though I were responsible for starting a bonfire, the blue and white tipped flame dancing in the wind. I stepped back, closed the oven door. Mama slid to her spot in front of the stove. I was able to cut the dough into 20 biscuits. Some were smaller than others and some looked a little funny, but there was enough, more than enough for everyone. Mama, I'm ready to put this in the oven. Don't they look good? I tilted the baking sheet so Mama could admire my work. Is the oven at the right temperature? She responded as she examined the collection of dough. What's the right temperature? The temperature that will cook the biscuits without burning them or leaving the dough in the middle uncooked. How am I supposed to know? Baby girl, you've been watching me make biscuits every morning since you could walk and talk on your own. You've seen how I work the oven. What have you learned? Mama turned the dial to the left, making a half circle of the full circle I'd made earlier. This is the correct setting. At the very top where you put the dial is the hottest. You can roast a pig at that setting. Too hot for biscuits. Now you have to wait and let it cool down before you put the biscuits in, or they'll just burn. That morning, Daddy, my brother Robert, his wife, Bernice, and two of my middle brothers would eat first. The men had been working the farm since sunrise, as they did most every day except Sunday, when we all went to church to celebrate and thank the Lord for our blessings. The men took turns in the fields, then came to eat in shifts before heading back out to the fields until dinner time. I was happy that Daddy was going to have my biscuits when I took them straight out of the oven, still hot and moist, the butter melted and dripping. The men on the next shift would have cold biscuits, whatever was left from the first group who had already eaten. I watched everyone take their seats at the table. Daddy sat at the head, facing the door to the porch. Mama sat at his right. My brother Robert sat at the other end, facing Daddy, and Bernice sat to Robert's right. Everyone else filled in wherever there was an empty chair. I wanted to push the biscuits directly in front of Daddy, but Mama had a certain spot for each food platter on the table. The breakfast meats, bacon, sausage, and ham hocks, were placed closest to Daddy. The scrambled eggs came next, then the biscuits. Pancakes and hot oatmeal followed, along with the seasonings, salt, pepper, maple syrup, and sugar. Jugs of milk, orange juice, and water filled in the corners of the table. Daddy blessed the food. I kept one eye open during the blessing. Baby girl made these biscuits all by herself, Mama announced after the blessings were said and Daddy started to fill his plate. Think I'll start with a biscuit. Daddy reached for the biscuit plate. I helped, holding the platter out to him. I'll start there too, Robert chimed in. Pass those down here. The platter was passed down the table and everyone took a biscuit. I watched as Daddy brought the biscuit to his lips. He took a big bite. Suddenly, he stopped. He looked over at Mama. She took a small bite from her biscuit. She stopped too. Robert put his down on his plate and began drinking water. The younger brothers screamed. They looked as if they wanted to spit the food on the floor. Don't you dare spit at the table, Mama scolded them as she grabbed a glass of water. Daddy had already finished drinking his water and was pouring himself more. Bernice nibbled at her biscuit and said, I think I'll have some water too. No one looked at me. I grabbed a biscuit and took a big bite. My mouth began to sting in the corners of my jaw. I wanted to spit out the biscuit, but I took a big swallow, acting as though I actually liked what I was eating. But all I could taste was salt. It was as if I had held the salt shaker up to my mouth and poured salt onto my tongue. I gulped down my water and rubbed tears from the corner of my eyes. When we were cleaning up, Mama asked, Baby girl, did you taste your food while you were cooking? Well, Mama, you knew I made a mistake. Why didn't you say something? The only way to learn is from mistakes. Close your eyes and hold out your hand. Mama poured something into my hand. Now take your other hand and gently rub your fingers over this. Make small circles in your palm. I did as she told me, slowly rubbing the stuff. What does it feel like? She asked. Soft but gritty. Does it have a smell? I held my palm up to my nose. Not that I can tell. Now wipe your hand clean, and I'm going to put something else in your palm. She poured something into my hand again. Now rub this the same way with your fingers. Does this feel different? It's softer, not as gritty. Does this have a smell? I tried again, but still didn't smell anything. But does it feel different? Yes. Now open your eyes. The salt and sugar containers were sitting on the table in front of me. The containers looked exactly the same, silver tins with tops that had to be twisted off. I'd struggled to open one of the tins and I was making the biscuits. I remembered I put it down to get something to pry it open with. The salt went into the mixture first, then sugar, but that was the tin I'd struggled with. The tins were next to each other. A cook needs to understand the feel of ingredients, Mama said. Touch is everything to good cooking. But the salt and sugar don't feel that different. Wouldn't it be easier just to use different looking containers? Baby girl, you sassing me. I'm sorry, Mama. Guess I should throw these out before the others come in for breakfast. I reached for the biscuits to toss them into the trash. You'll do no such thing. We don't waste food here, but they're terrible. Time for another lesson. Get the butter, milk in a bowl, and the sugar. I scurried around, collected the items, and placed them all on the counter. The oven is still warm, she said. Put the butter in so it'll be soft enough to mix. Pour the sugar in the bowl. Don't be shy. Use a lot, at least a full cup. I measured out a cup and dumped it into the bowl. Pour the milk in and then add the butter. It should be soft now. and then fold the butter into the milk and sugar. I work the soft butter into the milk and sugar, pressing the fork down with each turn of my hand. Keep adding milk until the mixture is smooth so it can be spread on the biscuits, and taste it as you go. Make sure it's very sweet. Add more sugar if you need to. Mama began to arrange the biscuits on the baking dish. Baby girl used the basting brush and spread the sugar mixture on each biscuit. We'll put the biscuits back in the oven and let them stay warm for the next breakfast seating. But sprinkle some sugar on top just to be sure. Too sweet is never a problem. So that's the start of Nell's life with her mama in her kitchen on the farm, and her mama teaching her how to handle food and seasonings.
Wow, wonderful. Oh my
Thank you.
goodness.
Thank
Oh my
you.
goodness. I hope you'll get a chance to look at the chat room eventually. You don't have to right now, but there was a, yeah.
Right.
Now, by the way, Jennifer, is this out as an audio book at all?
You know, it's not. And my project, I'm trying to decide now that a winter project for me is to create an audio book. It turns out that there is a studio right here on the island, not far from me in terms of around the corner, where many of the Audible books are recorded by a lot of well-known authors. I had no idea until I
Oh,
started reaching Audible. So I'm thinking that I'll do an audio book. And the challenge, and I was asking someone the other day, is that, you know, I enjoy reading, but the thought is, do I have to, one, read all the voices, and two, do I have to read in a Southern accent?
hmm.
So I don't know about all of that, or if I could pull that one off. So, but I'd like to do an audiobook. If I don't do it myself, I would, just get people to do it and get readers to do it.
Well, I have to say, one of the things that was happening in the chat room was people were commenting on how much they were really enjoying you reading it. So
Thank you.
that's a good sign. If we're one of your test cases, I think
That's great.
this we all really enjoyed listening to the opening. What a wonderful scene to open this book. It's so far beyond, baking a batch of biscuits. And I think clearly this I was really taken first by the crookedness of these photos and paintings or whatever, really looking first at the house through the art or the family photographs or, that sort of thing. And then setting up the whole dynamic of, I'm hoping we're going to come to understand what's sort of off kilter in this family dynamic. But then this really warm setting of these places where you have the family gatherings are introduced.
Mm-hmm.
And then this really strong mother figure coming in as this strong voice from the beginning, the way she is teaching and guiding in this sort of, in all the ways we might not expect. She's so non-controlling. It's a beautiful way of teaching. So I was immediately drawn into the experience of that. Someone said, by the way, Shirley said, "What a lovely voice and storytelling. I could listen all day."
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful.
And so Sipra, let's see, Sipra had a question I wanted to come back to in here. Okay, Sipra, 18 years is not actually child, but in India, it's the best age to get married. My mother was married at the age of 13 in the year of 1927. That was considered as late age marriage.
Interesting.
Where did your mother belong to? Did you mention Oklahoma?
Now, my mother actually grew up in Camden, New Jersey, and so she was 18 on the cover. But I found through going for one of those family, research programs that my grandmother, my father's from Louisiana, so there actually is a farm in our family in Louisiana, and she was 12 when my father was born, and I was stunned to learn that. I never knew that. 12. She was 12, and I learned it through the census. Found the census from that era, and there she was listed, and there was my father, and she was 12 years old. I was stunned at that. Now, not unusual for the times. Again, we were going back some time, and also because it was an agricultural environment, but people had a lot of children, and people started very young. So you're right, 18, my mother being 18 from Camden, New Jersey, I would think most in this day and age would probably think that's very young. I don't think people thought it was young when my mother got married, quite frankly. And my father had been in the military, and she actually met he was a Marine, and she met my father through her uncle, who was a buddy of his in the Marines, and they wrote love letters to each other and then got married when he got out of the Marines. So that's how they met.
Sweet. Did you say, I was momentarily distracted at the very beginning, and just letting people in. Did you say the photo on the front cover of the book is a family photograph?
Yes, it's my mother. It is my mother holding my oldest brother. Yeah.
So interesting. I was going to ask you about the cover.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was in my mind to ask you that, and because it is stunning. It's such a beautiful photograph, and I thought, well, you know, the book publisher probably just came
Yeah.
up with that photo, and then so I'm very interested to hear that that is
Well,
her.
what's interesting is that they of course were sending me samples of covers, and then I wrote back at one point and I said, you know, I think I have a family photograph that I think should be the cover. And I have to tell you, I could almost feel their choking on the other end of the line, saying, oh, here we go, right? Somebody thinks they could design a novel cover, right? We're another novice out here. And I said, no, I think just take a look. And so I took a picture of it and I sent it to them and I told them the story, and they immediately said, oh yeah, that's the cover.
Oh, what a great story. Will you hold it up for readers?
Yes. Yeah, actually, what did I do with it? Because I just had, so this is the actual black and white photograph
Oh,
that became, and my aunt sent me this. You know how sometimes relatives will send you pictures, because I didn't know my mother at this age, and she had a bunch of these photographs, and then it morphed into this as the cover, and the warm tones that are in it, and that became the cover.
that is fabulous. Wonderful. Okay, welcome, Andreen. Andreen is just joining us right now. Okay, so I wanted to ask one or two other questions. If you have a question, listeners, feel free. I probably can take one question from the audience. So if somebody puts one in the chat room that I haven't seen, I'd be glad to take it. But Jennifer, I was curious about, you wrote poetry before you wrote the novel.
Mm-hmm.
And if you mentioned this before, I'm sorry, I was distracted trying to get this this link fixed. Did you always know you were intending to write, that you would like to write a novel someday? I'd love to go back just with the point of inspiration or origin of, okay, I'm going to take this on. I've written poetry, but time for this novel. And then I'm curious about what kind of support or process you went through in terms of the writing of the book.
Surely. The first part, no, I don't think I always felt that there was a novel in me. The poetry has always been there since I was a young kid. So I've always done that. I would be part of, you know, local poetry books that schools and whatnot would do, and would read poetry and participate. So that, and then I was an English major in college and sort of stayed with that whole genre. After I did the 2 books of poetry, it was then that the thought of a novel popped into my head. And I can't say why, but I just felt like, you know, I can do longer form. And I started first doing just some real short stories, some sort of flash fiction types of things to sort of get into the mood for it. And I actually wrote another novel that's like over 300 pages that's sitting in my cabinet that I sent out to people. Everyone hated it. I got, you know, feedback, oh, it was just awful and all this really bad. So I put it away. So, okay, maybe I'm not meant to do this. But years later, the one feedback I got from everyone about that first novel was, while they didn't think it was well written, they didn't like it, they said, well, you know, there's one character that we find particularly interesting, and I think I'd like to know more about her. And to a person, they all told me that. And so years later, with this thing still sitting there in the cabinet, that character came to my mind. I said, you know, maybe I should write her story. Maybe they were telling me something and I just wasn't paying attention. And that character's name was Mother Claire, and it was set in the 70s. And so she was the mother of a group of young children in their 20s and 30s, and they were the main characters. So she was a very minor character. Well, lo and behold, fast forward to Child Bride, Mother Claire morphs into Nell, who is now 14 when this book opens up. And it essentially is her story as the young person. And as I was writing it and then working with an editor, what he described to me, and I didn't realize I was doing this, is that my point of view was first person retrospective. So it's, you think about you're sitting with a grandchild or a parent or something, and they say, you know, when I was your age, this is what it was like in Louisiana. This is what we, and so that was the point of view, was first person retrospective. And that's how the novel evolved. I did a lot of taking courses, you know, writing courses, did a tremendous amount of reading about writing fiction, even looking at, you know, Fiction for Dummies, you know, those For Dummies books I have out there, those yellow books. I went to that one too. I went everywhere I could to say, okay, if I'm going to do this craft, I've got to study the craft. And I'm a huge reader, and I've also know that if you're going to write, you have to read, and so constantly reading. And now I read with a whole different eye, because when I'm reading others people's work, I'm reading to understand their character development, the arc of the story, I mean everything, sentence structure, and it's not as enjoyable as it used to be when I just read the story. But now I'm reading the craft as well as the story. But it's very helpful to do that. And then I had an editor come on when I was about maybe maybe three quarters way on the book, and start working with me on editing. And that was extremely helpful to have editorial eye. And then had another editor as I was finishing the book. And there was a final editor that work through the publisher when I got to the publishing piece. So the process was very involved. And it was 3 years in total. And there were whole stretches of time when I didn't write at all, where I just had writer's block and couldn't get myself. But what many authors had told me, novelists have said, is that there is a point where the characters become real, and they have evolved so much, they take on their own life, and they start talking to you. And your job is simply to tell their story the way they are telling it to you. And that did happen to me when I would have months of no writing. In the middle of the night, I would hear Nell knocking on my head, and she'd wake me up.
Yeah.
You need to
For
say
her.
this. You need to write. And I'd get up and I'd start. I said, "Okay, Nell, I hear you." And I would start writing. And it was just an amazing thing to have the characters become so alive in your mind that they were the ones driving. It was like being on a Ouija board. Remember Ouija boards? They were moving my fingers across the computer and telling the stories.
That's wonderful. What strikes me in listening to you is many, many things, but I just want to go backwards for a minute to say, it seems remarkable about you that, so much of our writing lives can be an experience of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And then to just, you sound so philosophic, you so accepting right now of that. People didn't like it. No, this isn't any good. And so you just put it away, and then you don't give up. You just let this whole idea percolate. And that's a lovely story, because it's every writer's story in the sense of we've all been rejected.
Right.
And then what do we do with that? We go with that. So how beautiful to hear you persevering and learning the craft and staying open to another possibility.
Yeah.
So that is so wonderful. Now, one person is, in what way do you think writing poetry informed your prose? We'll take that question from Jerry.
Great question. I will tell you that at first I struggled with that. I sort of held my prose aside. In my mind, I was writing a novel, therefore that must be different. It was in my head. And so I wasn't thinking about my poetic voice at all. And then the first feedback I got from the very first editor was, "Oh no, Jennifer, you need to put your poetic voice into this story and into your writing, because that's where the beauty is going to be." And once that he gave me, it sort of like he gave me license to do that, I said, "Oh my goodness, he was absolutely right." And so from then on in, I went back and started from page 1 and had to start redoing everything and think about the poetic language, imagery, feelings, because we write poetry, and my poems are very concise. I tend to write very concise, very accessible poems, and very relatable poems. And that is always my goal with my poetry. But everything is grounded in emotion and feeling and senses and smell. I mean, all of the senses are in it. And when I started incorporating that into the novel, it just got wonderful. I mean, so people will tell me that they could smell the biscuits, that they could, they could smell the farm animals. I mean, all those kinds of things. But before, when I wasn't thinking about being poetic, all that was missing. And then it just expanded and made the novel so descriptive in all the scenes that I worked on. So it was extremely helpful. The hard part is that, again, my poetry is concise. So with the novel, you got to write for a long time. I mean, it was like, aren't I done yet? I mean, so that was the hard part. I can remember sending her wedding scene, which I thought was all done. It was like, it was 5 or 6 pages. I sent it to the editor, and he said, "Would you, Jennifer, that's a nice draft." And I'm like, "What do you mean draft? That's my whole." He said, "No, that is not." He said, "This is the biggest moment in this young girl's life. and it's not 5 pages, it's more like 25 or 30. And I sat there and I said, I don't know how to turn that into 25 or 30 pages, but I did. And it was just going back and really expanding on everything that was going on around her and with everyone else. So the expansiveness of novel writing was one of the biggest challenges to move from poetry. It really was.
Yeah, the expansiveness. That's wonderful. Jennifer, oh my gosh, we could sit here all day listening to you, reading more of this and answering these questions. But we will shift now to the open mic.
Yeah.
And now's your chance to sort of take a deep breath. And you get to be in the listener's seat
Right.
and have a chance to peruse the chat room a bit.
Oh, yeah.
And I just can't thank you enough. And I will put, again, I'm placing in the chat room the link for buying Jennifer's book. Again, I've put it in there a couple times, I'm putting it in again. And thank you so much. We will go to the open mic now. I'm going to turn off the recording.